Hello, everybody. Welcome to our book event with Frank M. Speck. And thank you all for joining us today. The way we're going to do this is I'll do a short introduction. Frank's going to talk a little bit about the book, and then our panelists will all speak, Steve, Alice, and myself, and then we'll open it up to all of you to join us with your questions and comments for Frank. If people are interested in getting a signed copy of the book, you can go online to progressive.org, and we have copies available for a donation to the Progressive, and Frank has agreed to sign them. So we'll have those available, mailed to your address as you choose. So again, thanks everybody. We have folks still coming in to join us. And this program will also be available later on both YouTube and Facebook. So you'll be able to watch it again later on. Well, I'm very pleased to be hosting this here. The Progressive Magazine, where I work, is a 114-year-old political magazine based here in Madison, Wisconsin. We've been covering labor issues since the very first issue of the magazine. Our founder, Fighting Bob LaFollette, and his partner, Belle Case LaFollette, were very committed to covering labor news, and we continue to do that today. And we'll maybe talk about some of that as we go on this evening. But in the meantime, this book, I know, is something that Frank has been working on for a number of years, and it was great to see it finally come out this year. Frank's been has lived a very interesting and exciting life, and we'll hear some of those stories tonight. But the idea of getting all of this within, what is it, about 312 pages, it's really, I think, a useful tool for all of us to be able to see the history and the choices that Frank made in how he pursued his work. And so we're going to hear about some of that tonight as well. Let's start by turning it over to you, Frank, to talk a little bit about how you came to write the book and what your ideas were in putting this together.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I wanted to say, I see he was here. I just want to say hello to people I haven't seen in years, and really thank you for joining this. It's really great to see that people are up and about at this stage of the game, you know. And that's partially why I wrote the book. I wanted, we had an anniversary here, a wedding anniversary, our 40th, and somebody asked my daughter what she thought about growing up in Lynn. We live in Lynn, Massachusetts for most of the time when the kids were up until they left high school, really. And so she said, well, it wasn't that we were talking about Marxism or revolution or anything like that all the time, but there are always these meetings, and she was pretty small, so she was close to the floor. So she said, all these people there, all these big boots, even the women. And she was speaking about my campaign manager, Sue Shepard, at the time. But in any event, so that was very impressive to her, that all these people would come and, you know, or be meeting and trying to figure out what to do with the union at that time and our union.
Maybe it's because I had the stream already running that it wouldn't let
it in. That's partially what caused me to write the book. I thought it would be important to have my children.
Progressive events. You're unmuted. We can hear you. Progressive events.
Yeah, there's anyway, so I thought it was important for our kids to get some sense of what we were doing and for their children. Well, then I was talking to people like Alice, who helped edit this, about some of this stuff, and realized that we were talking about two different planets, and that I'm talking about industry and big unions and whatnot. And it was obviously a different place. And so I was trying to say, well, how do we put something together that makes sense to a whole younger generation of people, 2 generations or more, because I'm going to be 80, like some of you, And, you know, how do we make sense to them about what we were trying to do, why we were trying to do it, and how we went about it, which was, in our view, you know, organizing working people as the lever that could change society. And then, of course, the entire working class in this country has changed in the 50 or 60 years we've been at this. So the sort of reference points have changed. So I was trying to wrestle with all those different things and come up with some narrative that would make sense to another generation, as well as to myself. And we wound up, I think it's 200 and some odd page, I hope. But anyway, we wound up taking this from about triple the size to what it is. And that's because of Alice's help, and mostly to try to make sense out of this. And so that's where it came about, just to try to reach another group of people. So I don't know, there are questions. I mean, obviously there's one big change, and I've had this discussion with the various people so far that we're interviewing in Local 201, the IUE Local 201 in Lynn, Massachusetts. We started a public history project and I've identified about 70 people, and we got UMass Boston to agree to come up with cash to hire interviewers and so on and so forth. But one of the questions that I'm asking, what we're asking the radical people we're interviewing, not everybody in the local, obviously, came there as a working class, organizer, why they did it and what they think. And so as part of that question, that you actually made a decision to go do organizing, and that it just didn't happen, and what motivated people to do that. So that's the other thing I tried to address in that book.
Well, I'd like to bring in our panelists. First off, Steve Early, who is a former Boston-based CWA international representative and organizer. He's still active with the News Guild CWA and is a freelance journalist and author or co-author of 5 books about labor, politics, and veterans issues. And also a longtime friend of both the Progressive and of Frank's. So Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about what you got from reading the book and to ask Frank some questions.
Thanks, Norm. Can you hear me? Thanks for having me on the show. It's a great privilege to be part of this discussion of one of the best memoirs, I think, that's been written so far by any 60s radical who then spent the 70s or 80s or more recent decades trying to change the US labor movement. I was a fellow Massachusetts labor movement activist of Frank's in the 1980s and 90s, the period that he describes in greatest detail in the book. As a CWA rep with smaller manufacturing shops that I was supporting, he provided invaluable consulting advice in one bargaining situation I was involved in with CWA members when he was working for the Center for Applied Technology. And I also later, when the International Union of Electrical Workers became part of the communication workers, got to work with Frank's successors in IUE Local 201, which was always a shining jewel in the sometimes not so great firmament of the IUE elsewhere in GE and elsewhere in the country. I would just pose one question. There's so much in the book that is going to be of interest to activists young and old. Clearly, Frank grapples in the book with greater freedom than he could in the past with the broader challenge facing labor educators and labor communicators or labor writers, when either their educational work, their classes for union members, or their writing or news reporting or commentaries or wins, radio reports don't follow the union party line defined, when they upset top union officials, when they possibly endanger institutional funding from the labor movement. And that's something that you grappled with over the years as both a labor educator at the School for Workers and then later when you founded Workers Independent News. So any thoughts on that for people who may still be in the field of labor education and people may be trying to find their way in writing for official or unofficial publications as labor journalists?
Well, I think the thought is to be thoughtful. The most important part of the stewards training that I did, in spite of whatever was going on in the unions that hired us, or if it was a community class, the unions had paid to send people to the classes, because when I started, there were community classes throughout the state of Wisconsin. We'd drive up someplace a couple hours away and do a class. I thought the most important thing was, no matter what was going on in the politics of the union, to try to get across the point that it was the workers, the people they were working with, and that's the point of reference. Not what the boss says, not what somebody else says, but where the people are, number one. And number two, to understand that the exercise I started out with all my classes with was something called what is a union? And people had to have a debate about it. And there were big debates because people would say, no, a union is something where you have a smart lawyer, or a union is something where you understand what the boss wants and the union's job is to deliver it so that we can keep our jobs. And then there would always be a group of people who would say, no, I don't think so. I think the union's job is to work with everybody else and get our point across and become self-sufficient intellectually vis-a-vis the company. And so I thought that the way to try to thread that needle was always to start out that way. And the end result of the class would be that people would leave it, even if we were disagreeing or they knew I was in opposition to something. I was a candidate in various offices here in the American Federation of Teachers. So that other life was not unknown to the vast majority of people who were in my classes, actually. But in any event, that they would leave the class with a sense that the union is really the union, that it's them, and that they have to begin to think that way. And without that, it won't work. So that was the way I tried to do it. And I thought that that would generally work. It was the same story with the technology business. The companies and a lot of the union leadership said, let's figure out, let's make a deal here. And I would say, well, that's a great idea. Obviously, we want the place to stay open. However, what are your criteria? What are the union's criteria, the workers' criteria for designing this machine or this work process? And let's try to do that. And then if it doesn't work, well, that's another story, but let's give it a shot. And in fact, the places that lasted the longest in terms of this kind of new technology and new organization, one of them was a big paper mill outside of Portland, Maine, where the workers completely redesigned the system and turned the maintenance department into something that took in work from all the other paper mills to fix these huge machines, and lasted until last year, basically, from 1990. And the other was Waukesha Engines here in Waukesha, Wisconsin, which did the same thing, basically, in the middle of a strike, incidentally, when we were giving them advice. Official advice on the part of the company, in theory, and the union, the machinists. And they also completely reorganized production. Still, after 30 years, were able to maintain the union's position, saying, this is the way we're going to do stuff here. And, very, very clear understanding of the systems. And so to the extent I was able to help people do that, to go to the basics, what are our criteria for running this operation? What is the working class and the union's criteria for a contract? That is the way I tried to approach it. And the Waukesha Engines is still there, actually. And again, it's 35 years, and there's been many attempts to close it. And it hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked because of the intelligence and ability of the workers in that plant to figure out what to do. Now, obviously, it's a new generation of workers. So hopefully the older generation taught them some of this stuff. I think so, or else they still wouldn't be there. And let me just say one other thing about that. I think most people, first of all, most people come to work to go to work. They're not coming to work to redesign the factory or grieve or build the union or anything else. So from that point of view, people want to get through the day without a disaster of some sort, no matter what anybody's doing. And so if you take it from that point of view, and that's basically what I was thinking about, then, you can talk to people about a different way to do things. Because almost always the way the management has come up with doing something is basically inefficient, wrong, costly in some fashion, dangerous or whatever. So people are up for trying to figure out what to do. People are not up for, a suicidal attack on the system in that regard. But people are willing, I found at least, to say, gee, maybe there's another way to do this. And the entire piecework system in the United States, where a number of people are working still on piecework, you're paid by the piece. That's the whole way the system works. Nobody in a piecework system that I'm aware of, and I worked piecework for many years on all kinds of shifts in different places. All the people that I worked with always had in their head, or in a little book that I still have, here's how you really do the work. So everybody was already primed to come up with a different way to do things. You didn't share that with management unless you were out of your mind or something. But the people knew that whatever we were doing wasn't quite right. And so there is an openness, I found, if you talked about it that way, to begin to explore new ways to do things or different ways to do things, sort of, undercover. I mean, let me put it this way to make it even clearer. What people told me about the third day I was at work was that you can stay on this job either because you know how to use your pencil or because you go kill yourself to try to make the rate. It's up to you, right? Well, you have to be an idiot not to get the right answer there,
Steve, other thoughts or questions right now?
No, why don't we turn it over to Alice?
Okay. Well, our next panelist is Alice Herman. She's a reporter focusing on labor, politics, and healthcare. Her work has appeared in The Progressive, in These Times, and elsewhere. And she was also, as Frank mentioned, an editor on this book project. So Alice, welcome.
Thank you, Norm. It's such a privilege to be on this panel. And it was so wonderful to spend several months working with Frank on edits to his memoir, and now to be able to read the final copy, which, as Steve mentioned, is just a really great and instructive book on kind of the history of the progressive labor movement in the 20th century. It's also great to be on this panel with Steve, whose writing on labor was also instructive in my work as a reporter. So, something Frank kind of opened with was this idea of the differences between the labor movement of the 20th century and the contemporary labor movement, and how can somebody who worked before deindustrialization in this totally different context relate their experiences as a socialist and as a organizer to somebody who's working, in today's economy and under today's labor conditions. And something that's just been kind of at the top of my mind in the last few weeks as a journalist is the effects of artificial intelligence, whose capabilities is improving and kind of growing radically and dramatically on media workers. So, for example, at BuzzFeed News, you have content writers or people who were writing maybe not investigative reports, but doing other kinds of kind of like culture writing or technology writing, now editing the work of an artificial intelligence, right? And so in your book, Frank, you write about responding to automation at the GE plant, which I think actually is relevant and will continue to be relevant to workers today. Can you share a little bit about that period and about how you tried to respond and how you did respond as a union to automation?
Well, yeah, I think it's the same in this sense. The whole rail dispute today here in the United States and France and England is one of the unifying factors is that the computer program that is being used to schedule this stuff comes from the integrated computer-aided manufacturing thing, which the Defense Department designed with GE in the 70s. It's basically what they call then manufacturing resource planning, or ICAM, but it's a top-down, very regulated system. So my sense at the time, because I had the opportunity to go from what was called conventional machining without a computer, ran a lathe anyway, to where you had a computer numerically controlled system. That was a control system doing a lot of work of the machine. So the theory was it could do it faster and better than a person. To an extent that was true, but it wasn't very innovative and still isn't innovative because this is complicated stuff. My sense was, what is it that we as a worker want out of work, among other things? You want to have it so that it's interesting and that's not boring and it isn't killing you and so on and so forth. So what are our design criteria? So I start from the point of view, how would we design this work to make it so that we can accomplish what needs to get done in a healthful way, in a way that builds us, not takes us apart. And so that when we're done with the day, we're not particularly worse off than we were than when we started. Now, those are pretty simple criteria and happen to be just about the opposite of what a company comes in when they design something. So that's what we tried to do. We tried to look at these systems. And I got my inspiration from a guy from MIT, David Noble, who wrote about a book called America by Design. And he was talking about the Luddites. What were they doing? You know, were they really machine smashers, or were they actually people worried about what was going on, about other things? It turns out the broader thing is more correct. He was fired by the National Institute down there in Washington on the Mall when he decided to have an IBM machine next to Ludd's hammer. He negotiated Ludd's hammer from England, and they were going to do this exhibit. And that was one too many, and they fired him for that. In any event, the idea is that workers can control and should control the technology that we work with, and it should be designed to accomplish our needs as well as the productive needs in the society. That's a perfectly simple thing. So it isn't so easy to do. Now, at the time, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, less so now, there were a group of progressive engineers, mostly in Germany, but also in Scandinavia, 2 or 3 here in the United States. And we had an organization, an international organization that actually dealt with some of this stuff. And at the same time, people like me, and I wasn't the only one, but in industry, were being faced with these pieces of equipment. Now, at General Electric, the company could not get it to work. We had more numerically controlled machine tools in one building in the aircraft division of the company than existed in most places in the country. The only reason that we had this NC equipment is because the Air Force said to all engine manufacturers, use numerically controlled equipment, or you're not going to build these jet engines for us anymore, for the Air Force. In other words, this was a military decision to impose a technology on the metalworking industry in the United States, which they did. Well, you know, their criteria are not my criteria, obviously. So the first thing was people said, what are we doing here? In our local, the more conservative business-minded people were in charge at that time. They worked with the company, but everybody realized that you couldn't get this stuff to work unless you made it more flexible. So that was not bad. I mean, they did that. But fundamentally, people said, this is just not going to do it for us. And so there was always resistance to this. People tried to find ways to work with this equipment and make demands on the company to broaden the scope of the job. One, to keep our skill so that we don't lose money, or the company doesn't say, well, you're all unskilled, then we're not going to pay you. And secondly, because usually if you had some flexibility, the job would go better. So, you know, there was a lot of factors here, but that was what motivated me. I mean, it was obvious going from the one kind of work I was doing to another, that the second type of work was simpler and just simply put out garbage half the time. And so, so you're getting hassled about making junk, and you've got a machine that can't make the part in the first place because the tolerances of the machine were not good enough to make the tolerances of the part. And I mean, and the Air Force simply just paid GE for the extra, that's all. I mean, you just throw out junk. I have a beautiful set of candlesticks that we used to make with this very, very nice aircraft brass to demonstrate how great these machines were. But the fact of the matter is, an aircraft instrument doesn't look like a candlestick, and so these things just didn't compute, and people knew that. So there was resistance to it. I don't know if that answered the question, but it's I think people, I guess the best example would be, well, it's too complicated to explain the part, but I think what it was is that many people, at least in what we were doing, but I think it's true whether you're a barista or whether you're a machinist or whether you're writing something, you want to have something where you create, where you do something, where at the end of the day, if you're washing dishes, the dishes are clean. That's your job, and that's fine, right? And anything that gets in the way of that is bothersome, particularly if then you get hassled about it at the end of the day or at some point in the middle. And so the technology should support these feelings that people have, not undermine it. And so there's this constant sort of tension, I think. And I think that drives, in part, at least in the 70s and 80s, people's hostility to this stuff, but also people's desire to do something about it.
Alice, do you want to follow up at all?
No, I think you answered my question. I mean, something that, just going back to the beginning of what you said, Frank, about workplace technology not only or not primarily functioning to increase productivity, but to actually serve the workers. If I'm putting that, I'm not sure if I'm putting that quite the way you did, but I think that is applicable across the board, even if you have, like, what I'm thinking of, the AI that there's an AI right now that, like, you ask it a question and it can respond with like a dissertation level kind of analysis of whatever you ask it. Much better than I could write it, much better than probably 99.9% of the population could write, and so even if the automated tool is functional, I think that the perspective that you're coming from of, that tool serving workers and not only productivity is really critical. And I think, anyway, that's what I took from what you just
said. I mean, I think part of it is a control issue too, for sure. If it's an extension of what we call Taylorism, which is an attempt to get everybody to do the same thing the same way forever. And I think that the part of this technology business is also, it cannot be separated, at least in a capitalist society, from the notion of control of the workforce. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. And AI is, I think, exacerbates all of the negative aspects of that particular vision, partial, that particular expression of technology.
So again, I want to thank everybody who's here today, and we're talking about Frank Emspeck's brand new book, Troublemaker, and you can get a copy of this book signed by the author. If you would like to make a donation to the Progressive, you can go to progressive.org/troublemaker and click on the link there, and you can make a donation, and we'll mail you a copy of the book that Frank has generously donated, along with his signature in the front of each one. Frank, I wanted to talk about the very last chapter of the book, the one that I'm most familiar with, which is, of course, your time with labor radio at WRT in Madison, and also nationally with Workers Independent News. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about sort of the lessons that period of activism brought forth, what you saw going into it and what you realized coming out of it in terms of the role of media in building a working class movement.
Well, that's going into it was a lot better than going out of it. When in the year 2000, Bush got elected, but everybody was pretty pumped because of the battle in Seattle in 1999, where independent media, radio stations or sort of instruments like WRT, news organizations really covered the working class on the move in Seattle. And so all kinds of people said, including us in Madison, but I see Wes is on the phone, and others said, geez, maybe we can do something. You know, our sense, my sense for sure, was that you had to have an independent working class voice, and that was fundamentally gone. There was simply nothing in commercial media, and is nothing now. There is not a daily news source that working people can go to that expresses of issues and concerns of working people, period. On the large media broadcast, whatever it is, it doesn't matter whether it's TV or radio or whatever. It's simply gone. That narrowcast, which is what I call the internet in a certain way, an individual program or a podcast. It's narrowcast because it only reaches a very small audience. It reaches fewer people than a small radio station in, say, the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin, which has 5,000 or 10,000 listeners. It may be to the high school basketball game, but they're not listening to us. So I thought to myself, as did and a whole bunch of us said, we need to figure out a way to have a voice, a daily voice. If you take NPR, which incidentally banned us and told any station that would use our material that they would be cut off at the knees. And this isn't a secret. We met with the head of NPR, some people on my board, and he said, here's the story. We will never broadcast a word of your stuff because Congress will defund us. This is after we won the prize, incidentally, which they took away for the best innovative newscast. But in any event, the point is that our model was marketplace on NPR. 5 minutes every day, your expense. GE paid for it for the first 10 years of a newscast directed fundamentally to say to people that raising the stock price is a good idea. That's their basic ideological position. My basic ideological position is that unions are a good idea and they'll raise the wages for everybody. Well, NPR, I know it's a shock, didn't agree with that, but neither did anybody else. And I think that on commercial media. So we thought, well, all these things happened there in Seattle. Maybe there's an audience. And then what happened was we had a conference in Madison. A couple of hundred people showed up, 300 people. We had the premiere of Bread and Roses actually in the Orpheum Theater here. 1,600 people showed up for that, much to our utter astonishment. Believe me, as chairman of this, said, oh my God, look at this. We can do this. And the next day we had a little meeting and about 20 people said, yeah, we can set up this news organization. And I, like an idiot, raised my hand and said, yeah, okay, we can do it here in Madison because we have WORT, strong station. We had a good collective of people working on labor radio. And we thought that it would be possible to bring in each of the different labor radio programs on community radio in some kind of cooperative venture to produce stuff. Well, that turned out not to be the case. But what we did do, we got the business school here in a contest. I don't know how Liz did this, but in any event, we became the marketing example. So we got millions of dollars worth of marketing research done in this competition amongst the graduate students and the undergraduates to come up with a marketing plan. Well, what we discovered is that 98% of the people in the United States listen to the radio. And amongst different ethnic groups, between 70 and 90% use radio news as their source of information, including most of rural America, incidentally, and the Hispanic community in particular. So I said, great, workers listen to the news. You know, the people that the labor movement needs most listen to the news. The people that the political movement needs to reach the most listen to the news. What's the problem? Well, the problem turned out to be that none of the powers that be, whether it was a foundation or any of the unions, were really interested in a news organization that said from the beginning, and our board was good about this for the entire 15 years we were in business, that it's an independent operation, that the Teamsters couldn't call up and say, do this. In fact, when they did call up and say, do this, in the middle of Obama's inauguration, when we had a national event going on in Chicago, they simply pulled the plug on it, took away $30,000 in about 2 seconds. Here we are on this national TV feed. You know, these are expensive. But we said, well, that's the way it is. And all the unions stepped up so that we couldn't continue the broadcast, for goodness sakes. But so we felt pretty strongly about this kind of stuff. And we went to the unions and said, everybody put in $5,000 or $10,000. We can do a national newscast, no problem. Well, it became very, very difficult to do that. Almost nobody wanted to really do this. Our total costs would have been less than 1% of the average costs that unions were spending on political mobilization in any election. So in the state of Wisconsin, for example, even though we had to, as a commercial operation, pay for time like every other commercial operation, which either pays in cash or pays in advertising, we could have been on every single county, every single city in the state of Wisconsin for about $25,000 a week. And given what's spent here, less than 1% of the cost of the average election for a year. And when you think about what would that mean in rural Wisconsin or rural Iowa, what would it mean? Well, we know what it means because we were on in rural Iowa for 6 months. And it meant that people could listen to something else. It meant on the most conservative country western station in Virginia, which happened to cover all of Washington, D.C., part of Baltimore, and so on and so forth, that it was the most popular news show for 6 months at $1,000 a day, which was nothing compared to the media market. Here is this country western station, #1 station, and bingo, worker independent news, our 2 or 3 minutes, #1 newscast. You would think that talking to the AFL-CIO or somebody else, they would say, wow, look at this, 2 million people are listening to this. That's terrific. The answer was, gee, we don't have time for a meeting. So what happened here, and I know I sound aggravated at this point, but what happened here is that we really wound up exposing, I think, the real rot, ideological rot in the American labor movement, which of course exacerbated our problem of trying to raise money from these same people. Now, in spite of all this, we had 10 or 5 board members, some Painters Union, the IBEW, the Teamsters, more or less, depending when, and several others that stuck with this through this entire time under great pressure because these guys were employed by these people. So this wasn't so easy to do. But the unions were also not willing to overtly just cut our throat because it didn't look good. Because we had, I think at our peak, we on a daily basis had about 200,000 listeners and probably about 100 stations, 150 stations. And then every once in a while, these things like on 1010 Wins in New York or WLS in Chicago, where we were the first people to be charged with fake news. And the station was fined $44,000 for playing our news. And KMOX in St. Louis. Now, these are the largest stations in the country, along with these ones in Washington and Iowa and whatnot. So we showed in proof in the pudding that this could work. And so that's what's even more disappointing. In New York City on 1010, which was very expensive, the building trades basically paid for it, 4 days a week for 3 years. At 9 o'clock in the morning, because the rates drop at 9 from 8:59, which is drive time. But anyway, our whole thing was that you had to have apprentice skilled workers doing the housing rehab in New York. The city owns 250,000 apartments. People were dying, they're untrained, falling through the roof and this, that, and the other thing. Several people a year at least. It was lousy work. And so we had this campaign basically saying that should be apprenticed work. And then every once in a while, you'd hear somebody at city council said, we heard this on the radio. Well, 2 years into this, the city council voted that any housing in New York that was rehabbed by the city had to have apprenticed workers, at least one for each trade in this place conducting the work. Well, now the result of this is the carpenters in New York have doubled their membership along with a variety of others. It's mostly people of color and mostly women. So there's a huge, huge payoff here, you see. And so what was particularly disappointing to me, and I think our board and our staff, is that we couldn't sell this. The union simply wouldn't do it. Every foundation that we went to, incidentally, said to us, the union should pay for this. I mean, the letter is in the State Historical Society from one of them saying the union should pay for this. It was from Rockefeller or Ford or somebody. But the point is that they're right. And so, but we never could get the kind of financial resources. I didn't have the ability to do that, to bring about a sustainable long-term funding of this operation. So eventually we ran out of money, and that was the end of that. But this one other historical note, I happened to just find it today. John Hamilton, who I think is still working for Democracy Now!, is one of our first producers. We found the last living person in the Taft law firm, as in Taft-Hartley, who edited the Taft-Hartley Act. And we have an interview. I have the transcript right here, historical document, and we broadcast it. What did he say? He said, our goal was not to abolish the trade union movement. We couldn't pull it off in 1948. Our goal was to pass legislation that would cripple it and kill it on the vine by preventing growth. Now, here we have this on tape, so to speak. I think it's something people should be able to hear and understand and get a historical perspective, because it helps us understand where we are today. And that is part of the value of having a national news service that has an ability to reach people. That's what we were trying to do.
And speaking of history, your book, Frank, I think is an incredible historical archive of the past 60 plus years of organizing on the left and in the labor and anti-war movements. And I strongly recommend it to people. Again, you can get a copy with a donation to the Progressive. You can get a signed copy. You can also buy it from various online book selling outlets as well. And at this point, I want to open up the conversation to everybody else who's joining us today. And I should explain, you're all muted right now. So when you want to speak, what you should do is unmute yourself, and we'll try to just kind of self-facilitate and not speak over each other. But if that gets out of hand, then we'll take numbers and get in line. But I see Mark Taylor down there raising his hand. So maybe you want to ask the first question.
Sure. Thank you very much. I recently retired from about 27 years of working as a psychotherapist in several different hospital systems, the last of which was the Gunderson Health System in La Crosse. And about 9 years before I retired, we adopted the Epic patient electronic record system. Now in healthcare, you have outpatient and you have inpatient, and the two systems run parallel to each other, but they also need to integrate with each other. Epic did inpatient electronic medical records first, and then our hospital was actually the very first hospital to adopt their outpatient program. Newt Gingrich was one of their lobbyists, and I'm not betraying patient confidentiality here because it was in the newspaper. Gingrich's father-in-law was at Gunderson and got to know our chief officer for the hospital. And our hospital forked over, I don't know how many millions of dollars for this outpatient electronic medical record system. When I retired 8 or 9 years later, that record system still could not provide a list of my patients. I had to go to the old electronic record system that some of our IT staff had developed many years before. And they kept that up parallel to the Epic system. The reason I bring this up is the discussion earlier about the IT stuff. I think there is a huge potential for organizing among medical workers. Because what these systems do, while there are certain efficiencies, it's a metal helmet of groupthink. And I found over that time that the dominant force that determined my interactions with patients quite often was determined by that electronic medical record system. And I was not alone with my frustrations about it. And I saw it be the excuse for higher demands of productivity, meaning you got to see more patients. Our hospital was a teaching hospital, so I used to do a lot of community outreach, education, parent groups, so on and so forth. By the time I left, all of that had been eliminated for generating income. But in the news recently about this this new system, GPT, Chat GPT, I've been following that quite closely because years ago I was also a newspaper reporter, and boy, oh boy, that is really very, very scary.
Yeah,
So,
let's get some responses from Frank. Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you.
Well, Epic, first of all, was set up as a billing system, not as a patient information system. So the whole design is based on tracking everybody in 15-minute intervals, and provides a tremendous amount of information that physicians don't need. There have been alternatives. In 1994, in Madison, we set up the Nursing Information Systems Design Group of nurses here in Madison to come up with a parallel system, which they did. And cheaper and more effective, and designed to have parallel communication but with the nurses, so they wouldn't have to have all the stuff on their pocket, and they wouldn't be separated from the patients trying to put in the information. And the orthopods here prevented its use in the hospital. They were in control of the hospital at the time, the surgeons, and had the two people who were in management, the nursing director and her associate, fired. So that was the end of that discussion. The university has never moved off of that kind of attitude, as far as I can see, in dealing with people. But that's the fundamental problem here. You have a system that's not designed to provide information, number one. It's designed to provide billing. So there's all kinds of problems, of which this is just one of them. The other thing that's happened, at least at UW, is that it's so bad, and people had so many complaints because the doctors are entering data while they're trying to talk to the patient. And the doctors that are particularly progressive and patient-centered have insisted that people are hire scribes now, so that in the examining room there's a person actually entering the data, and that's so the doctor can go be a doctor, which is not a bad idea. It's what you're supposed to be having when you go see a doctor, not a glorified secretary. So I mean, I got all this, of course, from my wife, who's an obstetrician. This is going on when she was practicing, but it was pretty clear. So you have this system that has nothing to do with healthcare and everything to do with profit maximization. And that's the fundamental issue that we have with these technologies. And I think that this is one example. If the newspapers could say that all the stuff is automated, just press a button and get rid of the reporters, they do it tomorrow. I think, I mean, look at this situation. Try this. You're living in La Crosse or living in the middle of nowhere in some state, and you have this nice railroad that runs through town, and you have this mile-long train coming through that happens to have 5 or 10 cars full of chlorine gas in it because they're going to some paper mill someplace, and one engineer who falls asleep, gets sick, has a heart attack or whatever. That's where the railroads, they're demanding one-person crews on these things. And the technology will take care of it. Don't worry about it. The precision scheduled railroading, the train will stop, somebody will know. Think about this. And so it's only when we get together and say, here is what we want. The doctors can do this. The medical staff can do this. The railroad workers are doing it. And so I think that part of the new, terrain for struggle in this country is, in fact, over the scheduling, over the functions of these software systems. People are saying, this is not for us, and we're not going to do this. We can't even do our job using this stuff. So I think that's a whole nother area, and I'm quite optimistic, actually. When you see that, and you combine that with one of the most automated systems, the whole barista system at Starbucks, and you have workers there, all kinds of workers saying, "Well, you know, we're not going to do this. This is just not going to happen." I mean, it's a tremendous thing, a tremendous, I think, growth in consciousness and understanding. Not all across the board, not everybody in the world, but a lot of people are raising the same questions that Mark raised, I think.
Okay, I see a number of hands raised, so I'm going to try and go through the list here. Keith Steffen.
Hi, we're talking about IT, and can you talk about it in terms of increased surveillance of workers and the loss of a sense of personal privacy, and also the disempowerment of employees due to computerized micromanagement?
Well, you know, talking about it, the problem is that it's happening. My sense is that all of these things, there are very, you know, when I can start off with the idea that some of the secretaries and the clerical staff at GE in the 70s and 80s, all of a sudden that you could monitor keystrokes. And so the company could try to increase productivity by saying you're not typing fast enough, not just by the number of pages that somebody'd have to give in or reports they'd have to write, but actually monitor the keystrokes. And so it's, if we start from there and we go to everything, where you are, what you're eating, when you're on the phone, you know, and I think all of this is an attempt to control the workforce and increase productivity. It has political ramifications, clearly, that are bad. But in terms of the workplace, all of it is to push people more. With piecework, the genius of piecework was you push yourself. Well, that wasn't working out so well in some ways. So, and the work became more complex. So now we have other systems to push you. And I think that all of this has got to be challenged from the human point of view, that we are not robots, we're people, and that we come to work. People understand they have to get to work and do things, but people do not want, and it is an attack on our basic humanity to have this level of surveillance. So across the board, and we see it, Keith and I have discussed this many times, you know, see it in the post office, see it in the deliveries. Well, you know, the fact that they can tell you where a letter is and then cut the staff doesn't mean the letter is going to get delivered any better. They'll just harass the person more. And so you see this throughout. And again, this is, I think, part of a development of a capitalist system, which is demanding more and more productivity and less a willingness to share the fruits of the systems. You know, and we have to begin to, I think, address that this is not just something that because somebody's nasty. This is an endemic part of the system of capitalism. And I think we have to try to figure out how to respond on that basis. Because it's not enough to simply win a case in a particular place at some level of surveillance is going to be somehow mitigated. Because we're surrounded by it. The whole system of Google, of Apple, of all these people is based on data collection so they can increase sales of one sort or another. And so it's a fundamental aspect of our new economy, so to speak. What we see are sort of the things that are most obvious. I just remember the Air Force explaining to a General Electric in 1978 says to me, or 1980, when we're looking at these systems, the company got up and had these big meetings and said, you know what, we're putting in all this stuff because we want to avoid punch card errors. Your error when you put in your little card saying what you've done for the day. We're putting in millions of dollars because we want to make sure that that the punch cards are right and you get paid properly. Now they had just been convicted of stealing $140 million in the aerospace program and had could basically close that division. But hey, listen, why quibble? So I said to myself, as our little automation committee at GE said, you're going to spend all this money because they care about whether we're paid properly? We already have a payroll clerk. What do we need to worry about this for? And then we got in touch with the Air Force, and they sent me this big book, a big thick book called Integrated Computer-Aided Manufacturing, of which punch card errors were about page 900, in about 2 paragraphs. The rest of it was how do you control production? How do you control the machines? How do you control where people are going to be, and so on and so forth. So I brought that to the attention of the union, and they, good for them, brought it to the attention of the company by dropping it on the desk and saying, what the hell is this? You said this and you're lying. But that's the kind of thing that's happening here. We see like a tip of the iceberg, but what's happening is a much deeper surveillance system that's going on.
Buzz Davis. You have to unmute yourself there. Buzz, you're still muted.
Yeah, there he is. He was unmuted briefly.
Buzz, you're still muted. Unfortunately, one thing that Zoom does is it doesn't allow me to unmute someone. So
Oh,
There
here
you
he
go.
is. Here he is.
Frank, it's this technology. It's too much. It's too much. I'm Buzz Davis from Stoughton, Wisconsin, now in Tucson. About 100,000 years ago in 1967, I was in the military learning how to kill people. I spent a year learning how to kill people as an infantry officer. And one time I'm reading this magazine called Ramparts. I think it was leftist, and it was talking all about the modern war that we're going to have in the future, where people will be able to shoot guns automatically, not there and everything. Today we have it, drone technology. And so the issue is, in the military and the infantry, it's people, and get your people to do these things. It's killing people and destroying everything that somebody wants to destroy. So what we have, and that was 50 years ago. And so today we're faced with the question of, well, do we really need any damn workers? They're such a pain in the ass. Why not have no workers and have all the computers do all this work? And they're these boys and girls that are such hot dogs on all this stuff, automating everything. They don't think about it enough to see how far it's going to go. And pretty soon they don't need you either, Mr. Automator or Ms. Automator, But the question that goes back is, what is the purpose of having humans on Earth and having them do a little work? And we know in society, people have to work together. Maybe we'll find that after we have a nuclear war, we'll all be back to square one. So Frank, do we really need workers? Let's have computers do it all.
Well, I think so, and it's nice to see you, and I hope you have those too. You still have those beautiful cars there in Tucson, but in any event, yeah, I think you need workers, and the question is, what are we going to do? You need them for a variety, you need us for a variety of reasons, but one of them is the production of wealth. Sooner or later, you have to have somebody to build the machines or somebody to do this or that, and I think that the role that workers play is to create wealth. It's not a gift. We do this in many different ways. It's not just to consume wealth, you have to create it. And I think that you don't necessarily, because of our wealth production abilities, have to do this 40 hours a week or 100 hours a week, 7 days a week. But it has to happen at some point in the proceedings. And I think that we can have a perfectly reasonable discussion, ethical discussion about what kind of work we want to do and how do we want to accomplish it. People are social beings. I don't think we work well or survive well, all living on our own little island someplace. That doesn't seem to work out too well either, as we could see with the mental health crisis with COVID. when a third of the country apparently is now in mental health crisis. In any event, yes, we need workers because workers create wealth, workers create community, workers share ideas, and civilization moves along. And in art, whatever. So I think that, yes, workers are an essential part of our humanity.
Okay, let's go on to Joe Barry.
Hi, Frank. It's really nice to see you, and I'm enjoying your book that I'm starting to read right now. You've raised a number of times when people raise questions, the issue of, well, what do we do about it? I would like to get your reactions to one strategy that is being talked about from an area that we both spent a lot of time in, academia, and the Higher Ed Labor United coalition that's formed in the last year and a half to try and build a higher ed labor movement, wall to wall, coast to coast, everybody, including it would be big hunks of healthcare as well as higher education directly and research, and everybody that contracted out people, to everybody that works in higher ed or on a higher ed campus or for a higher ed institution. Big workforce. Bigger than some of the traditional manufacturing workforces now in the United States, but represented by 13 different unions, none of whom speak as one voice and don't work together much, and don't have an interest in building a united higher ed labor movement. So the voice of higher ed is the is the voice of management and ultimately capital. Do you know about this initiative, and what do you think about the strategy of trying to build a whole sector-wide labor movement that in some ways is a recapitulation of the industrial union movement of the 30s and 40s in higher education? Everybody, wall to wall, coast to coast, and not just faculty centered, I might add, and not just tenure track faculty centered either.
Well, no, I don't know much about it. United Faculty and Academic Staff, which was the union we tried to build here at UW without bargaining rights for most of the time, I was president of it. The clue is faculty and academic staff. So our vision was everybody here. And we wound up at 300 or 400 members out of 7,000 at our height, but we're able to harass the university in some ways. I think that I could take a quote from 1877, although clearly the locomotive engineers had their problems with racism and whatnot. But the fact of the matter is the idea is absolutely necessary, and we're never going to get anywhere without it, as far as I'm concerned. We saw that in every single time when labor has even begun to move in that direction. With the CIO, for instance, in the 1930s, if we're not unified, and we're speaking with people who are doing a lot of the same work and facing all the same problems, we're never going to make it. So the first thing is absolutely, if I was younger, I would wish I could spend more time helping this or doing something to bring this about. My situation, my contribution, to the extent that I can make one, is here in Madison, trying to do what I can to stimulate, help, encourage our existing public sector unions of the university that were smashed to get together and do more work and organize this place, which I've spent a lot of time doing over the last 20 years or so, to no avail, I must admit, or very little. So absolutely, positively, I think without coming together, we'll look like the rail unions, 13 different unions speaking different ways, getting practically nowhere, and winding up accepting management's agenda, pretty much the leadership, although not all of them now, since we have a couple of new ones, that we can look at what the Railroad Workers United are doing, trying to bring together those 13 unions. And I think it's the same thing. I think it's criminal. I mean, don't want to rant here, but if we take the university or the state of Wisconsin, the fact of the matter is, if the public sector unions and academia had been united in voice and in action in 2011, when Governor Walker did us in, that wouldn't have happened. That's all. Would have been too many people doing too many different things, expressing themselves at work by not working, as did for 2 days at least, Madison Teachers Inc., by using the Constitution as their guide, freedom of speech, freedom of association. Okay, they tried that and it worked. You know, nobody was at work and the people really panicked here. But without that, we're not going to make it, in my opinion.
Okay, Lou, you're up next.
Hey, thank you very much. Let me get rid of this, lower my hand here. I'm very pleased to meet you, Frank. And Wes Brain invited me to this meeting, so you got to thank him for that. I love the Troublemaker title because I've been a troublemaker all my life. A retired AFSCME representative, and one thing that caught my eye after I retired was how much money this health insurance business was costing us. And so then, you know, being a union guy, I thought, well, union should be for the common good, right? Let's get Medicare for all here. Let's have, you know, pay a little taxes and then go to the doctor and be taken care of, not have to go through these money-making machines called health insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies. So, but I'm running into some problems here in Oregon where we have some unions, trade unions, but not by themselves. There's other unions that believe that they should use health insurance as a weapon to mobilize their members when it comes bargaining time. You know, like the employer is going to raise the costs of health insurance and give less in benefits. And so they use that to mobilize. But we're trying to get healthcare for all in Oregon. And so do you have any suggestions, being one troublemaker to another, of how we can kind of break that dam apart a little bit? What would you do in my case?
Through the same thing that you unsuccessfully tried to do in my case. I mean, the companies, first of all, there are some unions who organize on the basis saying, we have benefits, you join us, you'll get the benefits. Okay, now that decision came about in part by a leading liberal person who many of you have heard of, Walter Reuther. Walter the Weasel Reuther is what his enemies called him, because in 1946 and 47, when the unions were all pretty united on the issue of universal benefits, so that everybody gets them, some of the building trades, and Reuther among others, said, well, we'll concede this. We'll just have benefits for the companies, the people we represent. At which point you then set up a system where the unions then organize on the basis of, we can give you this, and if you're not in the union, you won't get it. And what that does, it breaks the relationship between the union organizing and the rest of the population. The same thing happens with wage increases. You have what they call the wage price spiral. Well, the companies are in charge of the wages and the prices. And so they give a wage increase, then raise the price to cover the wage increase and tax the rest of the working class to do it. And then say, see, the unions are causing you problems. Now, this isn't something by accident. You can read the interview that we have there that Hamilton did with one of the people who helped think of this. So the only way I know how to deal with this is to really fight for universal health care. So in fact, that it cannot be used as a weapon to go after us, to play one against the other. And in fact, from my point of view, let me just say here the vignette. So we're meeting with Generous Electric, and they wanted to talk to us. I was on the executive board of the union, but also an elected representative to the National Negotiating Committee. So this was around 1986 or something. And so they wanted to meet with our local, which was always going to vote against the contract, gave everybody a lot of trouble over this, about what could be done to get ready for the contract negotiations in 1987. So we're all meeting. and having a nice time there in our conference room there at GE, and companies talking about the big problems they're having with healthcare and the cost of healthcare at a time that they were making 90% of the CAT scans, the machines. They probably still are for all I know. So I have a little sheet there from one of their salespeople about buying a CAT scan and whatnot. So I said, well, look, I have an idea. And everybody knew this was not going to work. But anyway, they said, what is it? And I said, I think I have a way to cut costs here. Why don't you cut the price by 50%? And then, I have that as part of the deal now so that the total cost goes down. And they solved the problem by saying, see, we told you this was going to work, got up and walked out. That was the end of that discussion, the whole shebang. While some of the union people got mad at me because it was my fault that the meeting ended, right? And these national people walked out the door. I felt we had a good day. But I think you have to take a look at this, and that's where we got to go. We have to go to universal health care. We have to prevent the monopolization of the construction of these machines or reduce the price. They're making double anyway. And at the same time, when we get to the drug part, where we paid almost all the fundamental research. And I can assure you of this from a whole variety of places, including being an advisor to the director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology for a year. But all of this basic research has been paid for by us, the taxpayer. So the companies now say, oh, no, we got to do this and do that. Almost all of this stuff, the drugs, the machines, the delivery system can be cut by a huge amount if it was done any other way than what we're doing it in this country. And I think we have to make that case. We have to win that case. But I don't think there's any other way to do it. There's not some kind of smart bargaining way to get around this. Now, this may also require the elimination or the replacement of union leadership who has bought into this, which is another aspect of this. I don't think it can be done simply on a community level. I think we have to also win the organized working class to this notion as well.
Okay, and we have Gil Halstead.
Hi, Frank. I really just wanted to clarify one thing that you said earlier in response to Norm's question about the development of labor radio and the independent labor news project that you had. And that was that you said that NPR said that they would defund. You said something about they would defund the station. I mean, there's no way we could ever air your show. Who was it?
They didn't say defund.
No,
They
right,
said-
but who was it that said that? What did they say? Was this?
Well, if you remember, the guy who was one of the people in charge of NPR originally came from Madison here. But in any event, I and a couple of our board members met with I think the director, I'd have to get this right, the right title, in Washington, D.C. in the NPR headquarters there. And we had been called about a week earlier because there had been some kind of contest or discussion about, innovative newscasts and so on and so forth. And it turns out had been chosen by a significant amount of the staff as being should be mentioned or given an award or whatever. Okay. And then I got a call a couple of hours later or the next day saying that that wasn't going to happen because we were not going to have our stuff broadcast or distributed. So my board said to me, go find out what's going on here. And so we arranged a meeting with the whoever and whatever the title is of the person in charge of National Public Radio distribution. I thought he was the the chief executive officer of NPR. I think that's the way I would put it. I just don't remember his name or whatever it is, but the notes are in my papers. So we met with him and we were chatting and he said, I think you need to understand something. National Public Radio will not distribute your material ever to any station. And we will strongly counsel any station that's thinking of using it not to do so. So that was a little appalling. And so the board member said, "What are you talking about?" And he was the communications director for one of the 4 largest unions in the country. So he was aggravated. And then the guy says, "Look, we have a Congress that will defund NPR," as far as he was concerned, "if they broadcast a obvious labor newscast like ours." And I said something like, "What about, a marketplace?" And he said, "What are you talking about? It doesn't make any difference." Now, we had already been to Marketplace. Marketplace sells its minutes, you should know, or did at the time. And I said, "Well, listen, how about having a minute of our stuff in there? You're talking about this and the other thing. We can do a minute too." And they said, "No, we won't do it. We won't sell it to you, and we won't broadcast it either." So we were cut off at the knees. The only station only NPR station that broadcast anything of ours was a station in New Mexico. And that lasted about 2 months. And the guy called up and said, "We just can't continue to do this. There's too much pressure coming from Washington and elsewhere for us to drop it. So you're done." So that's what happened.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that because I'd never heard that whole story before. And is that in the book?
I don't know how much of it's in the book, but it's certainly in the State Historical Society. But let me tell you a joke here. Why not at this point, right? When we first started, we were an extension, and public radio in Wisconsin is an extension. So our theory was that since we're both in the same place, that they would take our stuff. So the first discussion was our technology was no good. And this was the mistake of a lifetime. We said, let's do a contest. We'll do a recording over at your place, and we'll do a recording over at our place and give it to some people to listen to. And if somebody can tell us the difference or which is better and which is worse, that'll help decide this question. If ours is as good, then maybe you'll broadcast it. So the head of NPR in Madison at the time, who then moved up the ranks, says, "Okay." So we recorded something over there at their studios at Wireless Hall at the time, and which was not completely digitized in 2000. And they came over to the School for Workers, where we had a room with little things hanging on the wall and a microphone, but a computer. And we did recordings. And so the great contest occurs, and the NPR folks picked our material as being technically superior, better quality, and so on and so forth. Now, you would think in a normal society that the NPR people would say, "This is terrific." Wisconsin Public Radio said, "Geez, we'll just copy this stuff. It's terrific." They got up and walked out and they said, "Never." And that was the end of that. So, the kind of open-mindedness we saw there was, I think, something we saw in many places, but I was particularly surprised with internally in extension, where I thought, at least because we're in the same business, we might actually have some traction, but that was not the case.
Well, thanks for telling me. I mean, I just remember that I did try to, at your urging, try to encourage at least the Ideas Network at WPR to consider using it. I got the same kind of response, okay, when I was working for them. And I'd never heard these stories that you're telling now, and it just, it's a sad, sad story.
Okay. Let's go on to David Simmons.
Hello, Frank. Can you
Hi.
talk about the Amazon campaign in New York and the effort to go it alone?
Well, I mean, I'm not there, and I think that what we saw is that you had a very committed and I think politically a savvy group of people. It isn't just that these people suddenly came together. When they did the biographies, and I've not met these individuals, but it turns out I did know about one of their parents. But anyway, I'm reading all of these biographies of the women and men who were active in this initial core of people. And half of them, if not more, had all been active in the local 1199, the hospital workers in New York City, when they organized in the voluntary hospitals in the 60s or 70s. The other half, except for maybe one person, they were all active in some kind of political movement, progressive or Marxist political movement, their parents anyway, in the community. So this group of people were all working at Amazon, were already had a sense of unionization and unions, class consciousness, and had been involved in the struggle against racism, and hearing from their parents, I assume, had heard about how 1199, by mobilizing the membership, 1199 was the original hospital workers union in New York, won. So that's to me, that's the great story here. And then the people did exactly what people say that you should do when you organize. You're serious, you're committed to the people, you don't screw around, you find ways to meet people, whether it's barbecuing outside the plant or whatever else they were doing, and strike while the iron's hot. And I think part of their victory was because Amazon was arrogant and didn't believe it could happen. They were arrogant from not only the usual, we're management, but also because of a racist and sexist vision that the people running Amazon have. And so, who are these people anyway? So I think that's what happened. Now, Amazon has since, upped its game and went after people in different places. And so the unions, the local people have not been as successful winning. I think we're in a situation, like I've said before to people on this call, that like in 1936 or so, if you take this huge Flint sit-down strike in 1936, right, in January, and we broadcast this on WRT as part of our commemoration of it, I have a long interview with Bob Travis, who was one of the organizers of this at the time. So you have 8,000 people working in Flint, Michigan, in the GM complex. 140, that's not very much. Those were the sit-downers. You got 140 people out of 8,000 here who said, we're ready, we're going to do this. Another couple of thousand had already been on strike in one of the other buildings. They said, we're not going to do this, but they weren't prepared to do that. So they sat down and did it. Well, I said to Bob, what happened? He said, because he was instrumental in making sure that they got in the plant, welded the doors shut, prevented the engines from being made, and so forth. He said, well, the plant was surrounded by workers and the police, and nobody knew quite what to do. And we didn't, he said, for sure. And we couldn't tell whether the crowd was with us or not. I said, well, what happened? He says, the police began clubbing the women who were bringing food to the workers who were in the plant. And the audience, the thousands of workers, the people standing around said, we won't put up with this. And blam, the union got its majority, just like that. He said in 2 days or so, something, just sort of like a litmus test, boom. Well, I think we're at that stage of the game here in some places. I say about Madison, Wisconsin, we have within 5 miles of my office here, my little room here, probably 25,000 technical workers, 14,000 in the university, thousands in the software industry, thousands in the high-tech biotech industry. This is the Flint of the century. And there are a lot of towns like this. And to me, this is where we have to go. It's not that everybody is a high-tech worker or at the top of these wage scales here. A lot of these laboratories want to have hundreds and hundreds of ill-paid, highly skilled working people doing all the scut work in there. Okay, but if this is where we are, and this is our challenge, to try to figure out what we're going to do in a place like this. And we've seen some nice little green shoots, like the software people in Middleton, Buzz, whatever it is, organized at the CWA, and a couple of others. But I think we're at that point. I think Joe is right, that you're looking to bring together, have to bring together everybody who is doing this kind of work. And I think it's the same kind of thing that can happen. At least I hope so. You have people organizing over here at Epic, and they've been at it for quite a while. We'll see what happens over there. There's 6,000 to 7,000 people in this facility out here in Fitchburg, Wisconsin. And I haven't heard about them lately, but on the other hand, last November, walking down the street, or somebody was on the bus actually, and they heard some young people talking who were supposed to be at work. And so Barbara said, hey, who are you people? And they said, we used to work at Noodles, which is a restaurant here. It's a chain. And then she said, what do you mean you used to work there? Oh, we were there until this afternoon. She said, what are you talking about? Well, it turns out that the whole crew, including 3 of the homeless people who worked there but weren't earning enough to have a place to live, several of the older people who had families to support, and everybody else walked out, closed the store, put up a sign and saying, this is need, not greed, stores closed. Well, I thought that was terrific. We were luckily we were able to broadcast it, and then people have disappeared. They were fired, some people disappeared. Company flew in their senior management and they talked to everybody, tried to hired some of the people back, raised the wages, but here is his store. This is one of the most profitable stores here on State Street, selling noodles or whatever, and boom, that happened. I mean, when that kind of stuff is happening, something is going on here in this country.
Well, Frank, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for participating in this event. Again, the book Troublemaker, Saying No to Power by Frank Emspak. You can get a copy of it along with a donation to the Progressive Magazine by going to our website, progressive.org/troublemaker. And also through various other online retailers that you can figure out on the web. Thanks so much also to our panelists, Steve Early, labor journalist, currently based in California, Alice Herman, labor and health reporter, joining us from Florida, and Frank, any final words as we close out the program this evening?
Well, I just wanted to thank people for joining us. I'm really, really touched to see some of the people on this program. I haven't seen some of you for a long time, and I'm glad that everybody is in good health. Else you wouldn't be on the program, and maybe I'll harass you later. But I just want to say I won't embarrass you now, but I'll do that later. But I just want to thank you for coming, and what a pleasure it is actually to see people and have people come out for this.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Alice, for your work on the book, Steve, for all of your work, and all of you for joining us. And thanks for supporting the Progressive Magazine as well.
Thanks for hosting, Norm.
Good evening.